Slight change to the agenda. It's still the same talk, which is the ITU and Openness. It's going to be presented by Jacob Glick. Jacob.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me here today. My name is Jacob Glick. I'm a Senior Policy Counsel for Google based here in Canada, so I do the public policy work for Google here in Canada. It is unusual for a lawyer lobbyist to be talking to an engineering audience, probably for good reason, so I appreciate the time that you're taking to hear about this. And I understand actually that there was a presentation on a similar topic yesterday, so I hope I am not too repetitive. I hope that this is one of those situations where, you know, they teach you in some kind of school where they teach you things about this kind of stuff, that if you say things 5 times, that's the only time that anyone will remember it. So you have to say something 5 times for something to really sink in, and so saying something 5 times is critical. So this is probably time number 4, and if we say it 5 times, then it will sink in. So hopefully repetition from yesterday's presentation on a similar topic is useful. I also have to say that it's a pleasure to be back in an environment like this, because I did the public policy and legal work for CIRA, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, before I was at Google. So lots of young-looking familiar faces. It's a pleasure to be not the only guy not in a suit. And normally when I talk to lawyers and parliamentarians, you know, that stands out. So what I want to discuss today is, in particular, what the International Telecommunications Union, which, as you know, is a United Nations body, is looking to do at the World Conference on International Telecommunications in Dubai in December. I don't want to look at it from a substantive point of view, that is, to interrogate the substantive proposals being made, primarily because the details of those substantive proposals are not known. So it's great. I can take shots based on rumors, based on what professors are posting on their blogs, or what people are speculating about the content of those proposals. But fundamentally, they're not laid bare for us to interrogate and comment on. That will be the substance of my presentation. That the ITU, if it is to increase the scope of its operations to include management of Internet resources or standards, has to undertake significant institutional reform. If that sounds like a dry and terrible topic to you, I apologize in advance and promise there's only 27 minutes left till the coffee break. So let's start. So first, I do the public policy work for Google here in Canada, but with colleagues globally, we're fully engaged on a number of these global internet governance issues. In your program, it says Patrick Ryan is speaking. Patrick is a colleague of mine based in Mountain View. He and I have written a paper, and I say he and I, but truly it's he. I'm along for the ride, and my name in lights. Have written a paper which, if it's not on the website yet, that is my fault, and it will be there and will be also on SSRN for you to take a look at. So we talked a little bit about what the ITU is, and I think you heard a bit about it yesterday and its history dating back to the 1850s. Oh, sorry. You know what? I advanced my own slides, but did not advance yours. So thank you very much. This is good. I'm not used to this high-tech stuff. Again, as I mentioned, at its December conference in Dubai, the ITU will consider a number of substantive reforms relevant to interconnection, peering, standardization, cybersecurity, none of which the contents are known, but many of which could, based on what is being reported, have a significant impact on the way the Internet is governed and the freedoms that Internet users enjoy. And this is not the first time, of course, that the ITU has tried to wrest control of Internet governance from existing standard setting and loose regulatory bodies. For those of you who are old enough to remember the World Summit on the Information Society, you'll know that this was an attempt driven by ITU members roughly 6-7 years ago to take the functions of the domain name numbering and naming systems and internationalize, which is the euphemism for bring under the auspices of the ITU or some other international treaty organization, the functions now exercised by ICANN and the IANA function and the regional RIRs, which, by the way, P.S., if I'm editorializing, would have been terrible. So one of the things to think about in this context, and I think is an important antecedent question to talking about the institutional structure of the ITU, is to think, why would an international treaty organization want to expand its ambit over Internet regulation? What would the motivations be? There are a number of stated motivations and a number of what I will say are imputed or implicit motivations in this context. So we'll get to some of the stated motivations, but I'll posit some motivations which normally are not talked about in polite society. Luckily, I'm very impolite. So the first is what might seem obvious, but yet often goes unnoticed, which is that in a world where increasingly voice telephony is less relevant, if you are in charge of the standards and operations for voice telephony, you are less relevant. And if you are any regulator in this context, you are probably looking to expand your influence over the new forms of telecommunications that have emerged. This is true in the Canadian context, in the regulatory world in which I operate. So we have the CRTC, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission. The Canadians in this room are familiar with it. It's the Canadian version of the FCC, roughly. And it has struggled with the same existential questions to a certain degree, which is to say, in the world where you move from a world of stovepipe networks where a single provider owns a single network that provides a single application, and you have a regulatory model that presupposes that industrial form of organization, what is the role of the regulator in the hourglass world where all of the single-purpose applications merely become applications at the application layer carried over the public internet, and these single-purpose networks become mere delivery vehicles for the public internet. So think of it, this is, by the way, what a colleague of mine, Rick Witt, has referred to as the virtuous hourglass. So you stop me if this makes no sense whatsoever. But imagine a situation, so a single company owns a single network that delivers a single service. The telephone company owns the telephone network and they deliver you voice telephony. The cable company owns the cable network and delivers you cable television. So that's the industrial model that Canadian regulatory frameworks are built upon, and that many of these international regulatory frameworks also presuppose. So now we've transformed into a world where everything is converging to the public internet, and telephony and audiovisual communications and data are all just at the application layer. There are any number of competitive services for those applications, and they're all just running on the internet. And all of those networks are just delivery vehicles for the internet. So all of this is to say that in this context, the regulatory environment starts to look a lot less certain, and if you have a lot of staff and a big building and an incumbency in Geneva that you're looking to maintain, maybe you want to expand your scope. The other the other rationale for why the ITU might be interested in increasing its ambit over internet regulation is that for many governments of the world, the internet, and this I think is a topic that's been well covered, represents a revolution in the dissemination of information. Right? I think that is a point that is obvious but worth stating. And the inability to control the flow of that information can be deeply threatening. Sometimes that's deeply undermining of basic public order, but sometimes, and therefore a broad public policy question that needs to be addressed. But oftentimes the flow of that information is free media, innovative culture, all of these things that in Western countries are taken for granted, but in most countries around the world, the communications infrastructure has never presupposed a free flow of certain kinds of information. And having a communications network in your country that is more difficult for you to control is scary. And of course, the U.S. does this whole environment no favors when in the context of its authority over the domain name system, seizes domain names sometimes without due process, and generally ruffles international feathers. So the anti-Americanism implicit in some of the discourse around these things also is a motivating factor. What is one of the stated objectives in this context, and one of the really interesting things for us to think about is security. So a number of ITU member states and the ITU itself have talked about the need for enhanced security for internet communications. And I think we all understand that the internet was probably not necessarily built with security in mind. There are definitely challenges that internet communications poses from a security perspective. You know better than I do about many of these things. We've built many workarounds, but fundamentally there are quite a number of challenges from an interconnected world. But I say this is a stalking horse or a euphemism, because if you look at Jonathan Zittrain's book, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, what he posits in that book, and I think that he's correct in saying this, is that the security risks posed by internet communications and by the open internet in particular will be used as a trope by which governments will seize control over internet communications and take it for the other reasons that we've discussed previously. So while there is a legitimate security issue to be dealt with, we shouldn't overemphasize the security issues and use that as a proxy for bad stuff happening. And of course, there's just a benefit for centralizing authority, which we talk about more in the paper, but in the interest of time, I won't belabor. So then the question is posed, so given that they have this interest in expanding their mandate over areas that are yet undefined but that we believe to be problematic, and given that the rationale for the expansion might itself be problematic depending on your point of view, does it make sense for the ITU to expand from the perspective of what the institution of the ITU offers vis-a-vis existing institutions? So, I mean, the first thing that is patently obvious but worth stating again is that the ITU is governmental. The people who sit at the ITU are appointed by their governments. They may or may not have particular knowledge of telecommunications or technology. They will certainly, presumably, have diplomatic skills, something I'm often accused of lacking. That's a joke. You're allowed to laugh, but if it's not funny, you don't have to. Is this thing on? I'll be here all week. Try the veal. No? Nothing. All right. It's a tough crowd. So, fundamentally, if I sponsor beer, it might be better. Nice. It's free as in free and open, not free as in free beer. As no, nothing. No. So fundamentally, the decisions are made by governments. And there are private sector members, probably many of your companies are members of the ITU, but those private sector memberships are limited, they're costly, and there's a finite number of, on a practical level, individuals and companies that are participating in this discourse. Not only because it's expensive to join, obviously not for companies like Google, in fairness, but for many startup and small businesses, it's practically impossible not only to join but to participate in ongoing discussions, even if you were a full private sector member who had rights of participation. And of course, there is no meaningful participation by civil society. So for the non-governmental stakeholders, for most academics, there's really no possibility to participate in the standard setting process at the ITU. This is borne out by, in the context of the basic database they have, the Telecommunications Information Exchange Services database, TIES, to which access is restricted only to members, and even for academics you have to apply, and it's not clear at all the process by which approval is granted. So if you want access to the basic documents describing the standards being proposed and discussed, and to comment on those standards being proposed and discussed, you have to be a member. That means a state or a paying corporate member who has a certain limited access. But it doesn't apply to a whole host of other important stakeholders. And this makes sense in the context of the history of telecommunications, where many telecommunications service providers were state-owned monopolies, so there wasn't a difference between many of the member companies and the governments themselves historically. This has changed, obviously, in recent years. Now, you're also, I suspect, aware of alternatives to this mode of closed governance. The IETF, the W3C, and ICANN, for all its warts and wrinkles. These organizations are open to anybody. Anybody can see, access, comment on proposed standards, and good ideas are considered on their merit, generally not based on the underlying geopolitical politics of the proposer or of other extraneous considerations, but on the value of the proposal to the ongoing maintenance of the internet. That is obviously a bit of a utopian vision. There's clearly small p politics being played in many of these organizations, and in fact there's some good scholarly research on gender politics within the IETF, but I think the broader point remains that the IETF, the W3C, and ICANN remain what we call multi-stakeholder and strong multi-stakeholder process-driven organizations, as opposed to the way that the ITU operates. So if we look at a case study in particular, in the context of the MPLS, the ITU has actually inserted itself into a standard-setting discourse where the IETF had an ongoing process. So without editorializing too much on why that might happen, it has certainly proven itself disruptive in the context of standard setting and has led to the possibility of fracturing and confusion if the two standards were to be deployed. And if you contrast in those contexts, and this is the point of the example, the availability of the proposed standards, you really start to lay bare the deficiencies in the ITU versus the existing processes for internet standard setting. In the IETF context, all of the documents are published, they're available for comment, and again, there is a multi-stakeholder process by which ultimately the standards are approved. In the ITU context, the relevant documents are available only with ITU credentials, and we've talked a little bit about the limitations on receiving such credentials. And ultimately, these standards will be approved in a closed-door, closed manner way and presented ultimately as a fait accompli. In a similar context, the Russian Federation, in the lead up to the WCIT, which is pronounced the WICET, again being held in Dubai this December, has proposed what they refer to as Web 3.0. It's being made currently without stakeholder input, and the Russian Federation is seeking endorsement of a number of other players. The purpose of it, the stated purpose of it, is a secure next-generation version of the internet, which nobody can argue with. But unfortunately, in this context, it's not sufficient for us to argue about the stated purpose. We actually need to see the particulars of the proposal to know how it would play out in the day-to-day management of the internet. So if, as a practical matter, it would play out to allow governments a kill switch over the internet in their various jurisdictions or with a global remit, if it would permit governments to seize and block content arbitrarily, either within their jurisdictions or on a global basis. These are the kinds of things that are important to know and understand. So you hear security used, but because you don't know precisely which security interests are being referred to, it's hard to have an informed and intelligent debate about it. And so we have encouraged the Russians to put forward that proposal in its entirety and with specifics so it can be properly understood and discussed. And we have heard encouraging signs, by the way, from their delegates recently at international meetings, so there is a possibility that that's going to happen. So, last slide. What can the ITU do to reform? So, if you've heard the rest of this proposal, it might seem that it's an exceedingly negative view both of the ITU and of what is happening in the world of international internet governance. I hope that you don't come away with that, but rather to think that all of these institutions have the possibility to embrace the participatory model that has made the internet so awesome. And that is the open, collaborative, multi-stakeholder model that is reflected in a number of internet institutions. And so we would hope that the ITU, before embarking on substantive reform and substantive policy agenda, would embark on a procedural reform and a procedural policy agenda to make itself and its as an institution amenable to the kind of internet decision-making which we know and love. So that means sharing conference treaty proposals, opening the TIDES database, and fundamentally implementing a multi-stakeholder model to allow participation from a variety of stakeholders, including the public, including academics, civil society groups, not-for-profits, private sector, and of course governments. Because it is in a collaboration where none of these stakeholders stand above one another in their authority, in their power, that we will have a better internet governance and a better internet. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take your questions, but also happy to send you off for coffee. So thanks very much. So there's crickets and tumbleweeds. So again, thank you for your attention.
We have
one question. One question. Sorry.
Martin, can you promise it does not involve jumbo frames or IPv6?
It costs me $2 Fiji every time he says that. And I'm not saying it. Martin Levy, Hurricane Electric, can you explain how Google plays with the ITU? You are a private company. You're technically not a telecom, although you sure play like a telecom. Are you an ITU D or T member? Do you have a voice within the ITU, or do you simply have to lobby the relevant governments of your countries that you have relevant headquarters in?
So the short answer, we are not an ITU member yet, but that may come. We are always talking to ITU and to these other organizations. As you know, Vint Cerf is actively engaged in a number of these areas and is a vocal critic of the ITU, but also engaged with the ITU on a number of files. Google is actively also engaged with the various governments to try to influence their views of these things in a manner consistent with what I've described. There are a whole bunch of issues. Now that Google owns a mobile handset company, it's unclear how that will change, if at all, our involvement at the ITU. Those discussions haven't happened.
Okay, and then just to clarify it then, does or if Google became a member of the ITU in some variety, would it have any voice at the Wicket in December?
We would have a voice at the same in the same manner that any private company that's a member has a voice. But for us, the reason why we are making these views known and being public about it and engaging in a public discourse is not really because it's impossible for Google to be heard in this context. As you point out, Google is a big company. Google has pockets that make it possible to pay for membership in the ITU, but we view the current model of internet governance and standard setting as a good one and something that ought to be preserved and maintained and championed. And so that's what we're trying to do in this context.
Can I just have a small follow-up? All right, just
Sure.
Dave didn't shoot me down.
He was tweeting about you.
Yeah, no, he's doing worse than that. Is there a way that you could clarify the first thing you said? It was very legally, oh, you are a lawyer, so it was very legal response. In the Wicket, do you have a voice directly, or do you have a voice via the government, by lobbying the government that is at the table?
So the short answer is I don't know the details of what our voice is going to look like.
Okay, that's good enough.
Yes, sir.
Rüdiger Volk, engineer working for the German incumbent, and on the internet side, of course. Well, okay, your analysis, well, okay, looks all like very agreeable, like many other things we have heard. Your particular suggestion for getting some reasonable output is, well, okay, fix the processes before going into conference or before producing results. And looking at the timetable, I have a pretty serious question. Well, okay, what is the chance if the process hasn't been fixed over the past 20 years that it's going to be fixed in the next 6 months before all the big wigs meet? And, well, okay, there will be awful pressure for getting some results back.
It's a great question, and I think the answer is probably very little, very slim. I mean, to be candid, I don't think that merely because we propose that the ITU needs to undertake institutional reform, that institutional reform is going to happen immediately. I think the implication of what's being said is that the ITU ought not to embark on some of the substantive agenda that that its members have put forward until these institutional reforms happen. And so if that means more delay in ITU action in this area, then that's what's required.
Yes, well, okay, since these conferences seems to happen every couple of decades, it seems very questionable that they actually do the big conference and the run-up for it, and meet there in Dubai and say, well, okay, unfortunately we figured out we should have fixed the process and we will not do any results before doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to comment ahead of time as to what's going to happen in Dubai. I mean, other than to say that we are supportive of the current multi-stakeholder internet governance model represented by the standard-setting bodies that I identified previously.
Matt Poundstead, Affiliates. If the ITU was to proceed with changing the way they operate in the way you suggest, considering there's a fair bit of overlap in what they would like to be responsible for and what other organizations are already responsible for, how do you think that overlap would play out? Have you or Google thought about what that would look like?
First of all, hi, Matt.
Hi.
It's great to see my friends from CIRA days with different hats on. The short answer is I wouldn't want to speculate. So you have to catch me over beer to get me to answer that. Free beer, even.
Warren Kumari, Google, mainly responding to Martin. So ISOC is a sector member, and they've been really good about providing, public sector input and feeding information back. And that's been one really good way to provide input. There's also the US delegation coming up, which is taking a lot of input from private sector members, so Google can participate through that way. Hopefully that provides some info.
Thanks.
Hey, Jeremiah Daniels from Internet Systems Consortium. One, a request. Can we make sure these slides are on the agenda? I know a community in California that would be very interested in this talk as well as yesterday's talk. And second, I had a question. Yesterday we heard from the related talk that ITU members were often ostracized or actually forced to leave the committee, and if they did not toe the party line. And I was wondering if you could comment on any of the internal politics there, or?
No, that's something that I really shouldn't say anything about, other than to say that I'm happy to make these slides available. As you can probably tell, these are a skeleton outline of a much better paper that will be made available on the website and will be up on SSRN as well.
Great, thanks.
Are you going to put a reference to the paper in the slides?
Am I going to put, like a link to the paper in the slides? Sure.
Please.
I mean, we can probably put a link to the paper just on the website, right?
Yeah.
So even easier. As you can tell, I didn't put super much graphical stuff in my slides because, I operate under the theory that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. I'm just lazy too, that's the real reason. Go ahead, sorry.
Hi, John Curran, CEO of Aaron. We are an ITU-T and ITU-D sector member, and our participants in education to the extent that they'll listen. Many of the organizations in this room operate only in North America, US or Canada, and I think the US and Canadian governmental delegations are very aware, but of sort of what we believe. For organizations in the room that operate in other countries, who may have access to other governments and other delegations, how can they educate them about what they feel about the internet governance system?
That's a terrific question, and one worth emphasizing that, I know the folks at Industry Canada, for example, who represent us at the ITU, and they are terrific. They understand these issues in depth, and I think that they bring a very sober thought to the table. For people who work in countries that have a participatory political system, I think engaging with especially the local governmental experts is critical. In the Canadian context, it's as simple as literally calling up the right people, figuring out who the right people at Industry Canada are and calling them up and meeting them. Because in the Canadian context, in any event where I operate, they're very open to meeting, and they want to hear from people who actually operate in this space what changes would mean for their business and for the operations of the internet, and for big picture for these economies, jobs, growth, and innovation, right? So it's all well and good to talk about sort of these narrow internet governance issues, but those aren't the things that always resonate with governmental or political actors. And so understanding how to frame this in a national interest, I think, is critical. And in many countries around the world, all you need to do is pick up the phone